Hello and welcome to MLOps London On Air, where we explore how machine learning moves from technical vision to real-world impact. I'm Alex Housley, founder of Selden, a company focused on helping teams deploy and manage AI at scale. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Saswati Saha Mitra, former Director of Insights at Meta, where she shaped WhatsApp's business, AI, and monetization strategy.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me here.
It's great to have you here. And just to continue the introduction, so Saswati brings a unique breadth of experience. She's worked across some of the world's most impactful AI deployments at WhatsApp, Uber, and Google, navigating both the human and technical complexities at global scale. And today we'll dive into how user research, data science, and engineering teams can collaborate better, scaling insights with AI, the emerging world of vibe coding, and what it means for the future of AI product development. Okay, so let's kick off. Saswati, fascinating intersection of experience you have. So you started your career in user research and moved into leading data science functions. Sort of what inspired you to work along that intersection?
So I started my career studying political science and economics. So which is why that love for number was always there from my economics background. So when I first joined and started doing user research, I've always been a mixed method researcher. So for me, the number aspect of products as well as the qualitative aspects matter equally. So over time, as I kept kind of doing both quantitative and qualitative research, I kept seeing the emergence of big data in a lot of tech companies. So naturally, some part of me was curious, which is like, wow, how much data are we talking about? And I think this transition was really, for me personally, fostered at Uber, which probably has one of the world's best data science teams and marketplace team. So to work really closely with them to understand what trends they're seeing was, I would think, just like the point that spurred me into thinking that, wow, there's so much more to do. And since then, I've been really fortunate to both partner very closely with data science, but also support teams in data science to look at like really complex problems. And I think what connects both research, data science is like we are all in some ways trying to go and solve a business problem. It's just that the lens on those problems are different. And I think a great collaboration between those functions gets us to those business outcomes a lot faster than if each group was trying to do it on their own.
Okay, yeah, that's fascinating. And you've seen different kind of modes of collaboration between the data science and the user research team. Can you explain a little bit about, kind of the different types you've seen and maybe what have been sort of the benefits of each of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've gone through like a stage where there was like, hey, we don't understand what each other does, to a phase where we're like, okay, we get each other, but we still don't like to work that well together. Each group wants to take the lead and so on, to currently where I think over the maturity, we've gotten to a place where it's like, yeah, it's pretty standard to believe that these two groups really have to work well together to come up with the direction. So which is why I think like when I look back at that journey, there's always like, depending on the life cycle of the product in an organization, you'll probably be in one of those. But ultimately, I think the goal is collaboration and just like playing to one's strengths and optimizing for when which group should take priority.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So in some cases you have user researchers who are in effect, uncovering customer challenges and problems, and then bringing that to the data science team. And then in other organizations, say like Uber, that's very data intensive, well, the data scientists will be finding patterns in the data and then bringing that back to user researchers to collaborate on a solution.
Because I think what the data science team wouldn't always know is like, why is something happening? So you will be able to see the incident in the data, but the logic and the people emotions that go behind those decisions are not visible in the data. And that's where I think user research is just incredibly powerful to give the product teams context about the reasons for why certain behaviors are manifesting in the data itself.
Okay, cool. And do you see that, like, within larger organizations where you're tackling a number of different use cases, that you end up with a sort of a squad type of formation with user researchers sitting inside each of the teams.
Yeah, I think that definitely used to be the case a lot more like a couple of years back. These days, I think it depends. I think right now the squad model of like being deeply embedded is kind of opening up a little bit, because just I think most organizations are working with lesser resources and so on. So what we are seeing these days in the market is both researchers and data scientists maybe like working more on initiatives rather than being deeply embedded. And when they take a particular initiative up to a certain level of maturity, then they move on to a next big problem. So I think there's that element of like being deeply embedded, but for a certain amount of time, and then moving on to the next big challenges. Like that's what I would at least hope that like the senior most people do, which is like instead of staying firmly in one place, that they solve to a great extent, perhaps hand it over to others, and then move on to a bigger challenge.
Okay, cool. Great. So, what advice would you be giving to kind of founders and product leaders now thinking about building AI native teams? What lessons would you share about the sort of structuring the collaboration between product research and engineering?
Yeah, I think my advice to most founders these days would be to just really understand what insights do you need and why do you need it. Because, like if you look at the current set of like market trends, like people with 5 people organizations are making millions of dollars. So in that kind of a team formation, it's really interesting to understand who is in your 5 people team. And that's where I think there's a lot of thought founders need to give, which is like, okay, how much of my data can I actually process myself? Because you could use those LLMs yourself to try and unpack those data for yourself. Similarly, if you are purely looking at market trends, you could probably do a decent amount of it also using like a Claude or ChatGPT, deep research. So it's like, why would you need these functions to be really working closely with you? And or like figure out a model of collaboration where you kind of bring them in specific moments. So I think these industries and these skill sets will go through significant change in the next couple of years, from being very deeply embedded to perhaps like more async and more sort of like on key issues rather than everything in a team.
Yeah, definitely. We're seeing that trend over time. In the early days of Selden, we were serving companies that had existing data science teams,
Right.
And those data scientists were very much in demand, short in supply. Leveraging a very sort of deeply skilled, kind of a deep skill set around mathematics and understanding the full data science workflow on a practical level. Whereas now tooling has sort of improved. You have more sort of auto ML has been around for a few years, and now these days basically anyone can be a prompt engineer. So in effect, there's been a huge sort of democratization of AI, machine learning. We'll move on to obviously vibe coding as well in this conversation. But so you mentioned your work at WhatsApp, and I think one of the sort of unique challenges that they have is around the building on a sort of a privacy based system, encrypted messaging, etc. So around this topic of privacy, misinformation, you had some interesting use cases around the COVID-19 pandemic. It'd be great to hear about what you saw, how were you able to tackle the misinformation online?
Okay, let's talk about that. So during 2020, I think WhatsApp was like, as COVID started, the product started to get used massively just because I think people wanted to stay in touch, but also businesses were trying to communicate with their customers and so on. And very early on, I think by like February, March already, we had started to see like press releases saying that, hey, there's a bunch of information that's probably false doing the rounds. and WhatsApp's kind of at the heart of it. So we need to figure out how WhatsApp will solve this, right? So, and our leadership takes that very seriously. We do want WhatsApp to be a platform where you get trusted, useful information. So what we did at that point was, there's no way to see that, okay, if someone is sending a photo or a video, because WhatsApp is encrypted, we can't really say, oh, this video is a piece of misinformation. We just don't have that, right? So what happens was that the way to understand what is happening on the platform was basically via research. So we had to kind of go out there in different parts of the world, all very remotely, to try and understand what is it that people were getting in those days, and how would we know that that's a piece of misinformation. What we soon realized was it's really hard to categorize misinformation, because sometimes it's like that information may not be relevant for you, but it may be relevant for someone else. Or you may find it misinformation, but someone else might think that's a comic piece. So there's a lot of subjectivity around what this is. So where we ended up going with it is, we ended up seeing that, okay, one is we can't see that content, so we can't really label something as misinformation. Two is that it is very subjective. So we pivoted our strategy from trying to discover misinformation to actually trying to empower users to take a better judgment based on the content they were seeing, so that we were not taking a decision based on them. So what we ended up seeing is that a lot of these pieces of content which could be suspicious were actually forwarded multiple times. So we had the metadata of that. So we were able to leverage that metadata to just design at that point an intervention, which back in the days used to be like 2 arrows, and we had a tag there forwarded many times, to not necessarily tell a user that, hey, this is misinformation, but rather to just make them a little bit more sensitized to the fact that this could potentially be misinformation. So just exercise some caution. We designed that intervention, and then there was the other aspect, which was like, right, so you have an intervention, but that still does not necessarily curb the virality of some of these conversations. So what do you do about that? So we ran multiple set of experiments to say, is there a point of like how many times these messages should be forwarded before which we should say, no, you can't forward it anymore because you could be potentially causing harm. And our experiments showed that there's like really no good one cutoff point, or if you do this many number, after that there's a drop off. So that was a really interesting moment, I think, for me, because I was like, right, there is no stat sig answer here that we could all just automatically go execute on. So we ended up taking a leadership decision at that point, which is like, let's just go with the lowest number, reduce the virality, so you could only send that message in one shot to one group or one conversation. And what that did was that it definitely reduced the virality of content on WhatsApp. But what it did in that specific moment was that it really enabled us to stick to our privacy principle, that we didn't go scanning messages.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
It gave more protection to the users than less, which we, I think, really value. And then third was we left the decision about the content to the end user. So we are not really in the business of intervening on your personal judgment. So net, while there wasn't like a very clear answer, we did manage to enable the users and reduce the virality to the best extent possible.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great use case. And, I think the trends have been moving more towards kind of, open conversation online and, reducing the kind of censorship from, whether it's organization or government level, that kind of thing. And, in general, that's a good thing. If people at least know that they can go to the source to, verify something that they've read online. And I think that's a really good skill set for people to have, to sort of critical thinking. Yes. Understand that something has been said, but then kind of, take the effort to verify it. So that's great, and probably quite ahead of your time, in that respect.
I think, if not ahead of time, then at least in time.
Yeah.
Because that is when the crisis was happening, and I think it was just like a right in time intervention. So yeah, I think that was definitely both as a WhatsApp user, but also as an employee of WhatsApp at that time. I personally felt like really accountable for getting this solution out to our end users, because if there was any problem with the platform, you definitely have to intervene in some shape and form.
Great. And so in that case, you had the constraints of the encrypted messaging, so there's little context that you could get from that content. So with those constraints more broadly at WhatsApp, when you were working on data science use cases, what are the kinds of things that you were able to use cases you were able to solve on this platform, to enable sort of rich business user experiences, etc.?
So the way to think about WhatsApp and business solutions is it's always a partnership between WhatsApp and other Meta teams. So the way we operate, for instance, let's take like an ads business, right? So in the ads business, the entire surfacing of the ads is managed by a Meta team. So which means that in a non-encrypted like platform like Facebook or Instagram, you have a scenario where those teams are very much able to see what are the levels of interaction that's happening in the product. So we do have data from that. Now, where the data stops is like once you come into WhatsApp, we are not saying, oh, how many time you clicked on this and how many time you did X, because that would be against our privacy policy, right? So it's an interesting combination of measuring the things that are inside and till the message comes into WhatsApp. Once it comes into WhatsApp, then we have some just very fundamental basic like kind of metadata, which looks at like forwards and so on. And we work with that. So it's both interesting and challenging, because I think what's interesting is like how curious and creative you need to be to maintain a high privacy product, and challenging because it would be a lot easier if you had all the data through and through of the entire user experience. So not just like before it comes into WhatsApp, but also after and so on. So I think it's like there's nothing wrong in it. It's just like mostly how the products operate.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, it's a balance of, providing that private messaging whilst enabling, the kind of the foundational advertising system to run in the background. Great. And so, what were some of the major challenges or unexpected opportunities that you found when building these AI features in privacy first?
I mean, I think the biggest opportunity is like that unlike a lot of other Meta products, like there is just a very high level of inherent trust in WhatsApp and what WhatsApp does. And I think the whole team takes it very seriously, that responsibility that like 3 billion people put on you, right? So I think that in itself is just a privilege to be able to kind of keep that trust going. The challenges is basically sometimes, like I think with the misinformation case, is like you may not be able to 100% solve the problem. And yet you still have to take a shot at it, get to 60-70% success and be comfortable with it. Whereas like if you had the data and you could track everything, you could probably solve for everything. So I think the challenges is like it's never perfect. It's only goes up to a certain extent because of the privacy defense.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Actually, this made me think as well. We didn't discuss this earlier, but just really thinking about like when operating at that scale and billions of end users, the cost to compute on that level is just enormous. And this is what's pushing more of a sort of decentralized AI approach and things like federated learning. Is that something that you were sort of exploring more at that time, or thoughts about how much that is going to be a big part of the future?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that is going to be a big part of the future. So I think the way to kind of think about it is like, what are those learnings that we really think we need, right? And as part of being a big organization, you can also not just like learn by doing things yourself, but there's so much history. So I feel like in some degree, like every company that's part of the Meta overall umbrella is incredibly lucky, because you just have like decades of history in other organizations and mistakes that maybe they've done, which you just don't need to repeat, right? So that itself kind of accelerates your growth and learnings a lot faster.
Yeah.
And now with AI, I think just like the fact that all of this wisdom kind of exists in the meta LLMs and in other tools means that the organization should be able to operate a lot faster with that collective knowledge and optimizing for specific use cases.
Great. So let's switch track on to kind of scaling research and insights with AI tools. So, so traditionally, like user research was very slow, labor intensive, and you mentioned using AI-enabled tools to transform the speed and depth of insight. So, how is AI changing the nature of user research today?
So the way to think about AI's impact on user research, I think it's twofold. One is like there's a big operational push. So there's a lot of startups right now that are just building AI-enabled tools that let researchers do their job like a lot faster and at scale. So I think like very recently there was a company called Listen Labs that got a massive round, and their job is like they allow audio research to happen at scale, and a researcher could probably finish what they would have normally done, say, in a week's time, hopefully in a couple of hours, if not an hour, right? So there's that operational angle, which I think is getting a lot of interest and investment. And then there is the other part of it, which is like, hey, how do you actually make research better? So it's not the operational, but it's more on the quality side. And there's also a bunch of tools, like one which kind of stands out for me is like maybe like Street Bees. So it's a quant qual platform, and what they do is if you upload a set of questions that you want to ask the end user, as those responses come in, they are able to actually prompt you to say, hey, you should probably add certain things like this because there's a trend forming. Which is amazing, because what it does mean is that before, like, it was only, I would think, very seasoned researchers who would be able to kind of analyze on the go and suggest those tweaks. And the great researchers do that, right? So they do that. And now here you have a system which is also kind of prompting that. And whether you choose it or not, that's up to you. But I think just seeing those live prompts is really exciting, because suddenly you'll realize that even your entry-level researcher now has a tool which can up-level them. So I find that really fascinating. And I'm like, more of those, because then the sort of the level of research from day one goes much higher.
Yeah, that's great. We have a sort of biannual roadmap week where we showcase what's coming down the roadmap over the next couple of quarters, as well as really like connecting and listening to our customers. And in those sessions we have a big chunk of our product, tech, customer success teams. And it's a well worthwhile exercise, of course, but I can definitely see how much planning goes into it, as well as then the consolidation of these hours and hours of conversations. So in what you're effectively saying is that that's something which can be scaled up. You can have a unstructured conversation. I mean, some of the best insights you get are from listening to the customer, not just having a set of survey questions and listening to their insights and then interpreting and structuring those into some report output that kind of consolidates where those patterns are in the feedback. So that's great, and I suppose that's something which would be more beneficial as well to, say, organizations that just have maybe they're consumer facing, maybe they're kind of more SaaS at scale, like they've got thousands or millions of customers. You can't, it's very hard to sit in a room with each of them for an hour and a half, but you can do that with a more AI focused system. So that's cool. And so looking ahead then, how do you see a world where AI not only accelerates research but also assists in kind of reality checking models, especially for like LLMs and agent-based systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do expect, like, just based on the little explorations that I have done, one of the ways in which I operate with LLMs is like I always ask them to explain their process and what they are seeing. And what's interesting about that is like you suddenly realize that, okay, like what is it that the ALM is tracking on, which perhaps as a human I may or may not have always picked up, because there's like the multivariate aspect of it is what I find really fascinating. So which I would think that as long as like people exercise some sort of critical judgment and not just like take what the LLM is generating at face value, but actually prompt around its process, I think that's where some amazing learning is happening as a person who's doing the prompt, but also sound checking with like if the LLM's like generating the right logic. So I find that aspect of like, the technical skills still being very required. And while a lot of like AI can enable scale and everything, you still need the humans to do that sound check. And the more high quality that can be, I think the output's also just going to be more amazing. And I think that goes for both like research, data science, pretty much all functions and skills.
Yeah, yes, and then I think that's something which has shown massive progress in the last few months, even really like since I think my first time I saw DeepSeek V3, I think it is the latest one, showing its sort of thinking phase. You can really see from that kind of where perhaps it might be interpreting your prompt in a way that could be improved. Actually, quite quickly from that point, we saw this thinking phase enabled across basically all the leading LLMs, whether it's open or closed as a service like ChatGPT. It's more than just a cool demo. It's something which I think people can use as a tool, to improve the model. I found as well, like there's things like saying, LLMs quite often they want to, give you an output, to solve the problem, and sometimes it will, make assumptions in order to get to that output, rather than stop and say, hey, wait a second, I'm not 100% sure about this part of the prompt. Can you give me more information?
Exactly.
And I think
and I think that's also coming. I do think like in order to build traction in a marketplace with such a novel concept, right? Like you do have to kind of, as an LLM, you have to kind of appear really authoritative, right? Because if you're like really like wishy-washy at the beginning, why would anyone trust you? But I think as using LLMs become a core part of our lives, the more interesting way to go would be for the LLMs to have that human aspect, I would think, of knowing where they are really confident as part of the system and where there's like gray spaces, because that's where I find like the human machine interaction really interesting, when it's like problem solving together rather than say just expecting quick output. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who expect a quick output, but for those who are really savvy and curious, I think it's that back and forth which really creates value. At least for the humans. I don't know about the machines, but at least for the humans, I think it creates a lot of value in understanding what trade-offs are we making.
I've seen more of that kind of requesting more info from O3,
right?
From OpenAI, and just from sort of the testing things like Cursor and the coding the AI coding platforms out there. So actually even GitHub Copilot has evolved a lot as well recently. I've noticed the latest Visual Studio Code has an agentic mode as well. So perhaps that movement towards more of an agent-based interaction model is kind of conducive to the problem solving, breaking it down into steps, and then figuring out what's next, right? And especially in the AI coding world, right? That's something where the nature of how a developer would think about, solving, for doing their job, solving a problem and writing code often is breaking things down into smaller parts. And so...
so in that sense, I think it's very similar. Like, I don't think it changes that much. Perhaps the only variable is like you're now doing that kind of co-analysis with a machine than perhaps a human, right? But the fundamental philosophy is still the same.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So I suppose that leads us nicely into the next topic, which is around actually the future of dev tooling, vibe coding, and sort of accessible machine learning. So you've been experimenting a bit with vibe coding, so using new tooling to prototype fully functional experiences without needing a full engineering team.
Right.
How do you see this evolution of dev tooling enabling non-engineers or even non-data scientists to build value and validate ideas?
Yeah, I mean, this year has been very thrilling just for that. Like, I think the growth we've seen in Q1 in some of these sort of self-code and like help with AI I think it's like really enabling for people who are builders at heart. Mm-hmm. So, like I was like looking at my own journey and reflecting on, like, I built a company back in 2011, 2012. And one of the biggest challenge at that point was the engineering resources to even build up an initial demo, and had to kind of rely on different friends and so on. Whereas like here, I was able to just like demo up like a random product. I've made quite a few of them these days, but I'm like the very first one, I was able to just like have a completely functional demo in like under 2 hours.
Yeah,
I was just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, right? Like, this is amazing. So I am super bullish. And I think what that means for me personally, when I think about like the inside space, is like, there's just like a possibility, I think, of a lot of just like self-serve work happening, which is great, because in the future, like, like right now, for instance, there's a lot of dependency between, say, a data scientist and a data engineer to build the pipelines, then get the data through it, then the analysis and all. And I actually absolutely believe that the similar tools that Lovable and Bolt are building are also applicable for the data space. So it's just like, I'm sure there's going to be some specialized person who's building that somewhere in the world right now, and it's going to come out in a big way soon. Mm-hmm. So I feel really bullish, which is like, I think in the future, perhaps it'll maybe, in my head, I'm like, if this does become true, I think those two functions could become interchangeable, which is like a data scientist could build the data pipelines and look at like how that works, and a data engineer could also just run the analysis. So perhaps those functions will not be as separate or as distinct as they are right now.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it makes sense. Yeah, if the tooling is enabling the data scientists to do their job more effectively, or someone to, in effect, solve, the same problems as a data scientist, that's going to, really, revolutionize that kind of feedback loop that you get on the product cycle. And, I think on that point, that the categories of products which are emerging, which are sort of breaking out over the last year, I've been hearing is like kind of AI and agentic platforms that basically replicate the role of a specific function. So you get something like XAI, for example, replicating the role of an SDR, doing end-to-end kind of custom market research, pipeline generation, email outreach, responding, etc. The coding is kind of like sort of ranges from assistance through to effectively, if you can structure your requirements in a neat way, that you can press the button and effectively get something out which will work end to end. To then having a data scientist function that can interpret the data and build models off the back of that. And I mean, would you agree that like the business of the future is kind of like building a single, in effect, proprietary model asset through all of these different functions that they can all feed into? and they can kind of, like when the data scientist gets started with its job,
they inherit
what has effectively been done through the engineering team, so they don't have to start from scratch.
I would think so. I mean, I would think. I mean, I'm on the fence on the full proprietary part because I think, like, if I look at the trend right now, I think the real benefit is just using multiple systems, right? But yes, of course, I do think like different organizations will have some proprietary aspects of their learning knowledge toolkit, which we will all inherit, which then accelerates what's the ground zero that you start from. But in an ideal world, I wouldn't want that to be too proprietary, because then you are missing out on a lot of the innovation that's happening out there, right? Which you should be able to plug in and actually make your model better.
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting balance between how much is like owned by the company and how much are you kind of connecting with other systems to evolve faster.
Yeah. So in effect, more along the lines of, say, a kind of a fine tuning or a sharing of like LLM histories and memory.
That's right.
Rather than
that's what we
to
hope
build.
for. Yeah, that's what we hope for. We'll see, because these are not easy to build or cheap to maintain and all of that. So we'll see how the market evolves around it.
Yeah.
But I think the general open connection philosophy of LLMs so far has been good to see.
Yeah, I mean, it really blows my mind that the models of this scale and complexity, built on a transformer architecture, you can effectively take, some fine tuning that from one generation of the model and apply it to the next generation, or also another, model trained by a different company, but with the same architecture, and just, lift and shift and, benefit from the corpus of data that's been used to train the, the the newer model. Actually, so on a similar note then, like there's the interoperability around how agentic systems actually interface with the outside world. And, we've moved from using LLMs to improve experience, kind of the user experience from within a contained space, but then now like agents are dialing out to other services, whether it's checking on a customer's payment record, or checking on making a booking within another service.
Right.
So we're seeing this new standard emerge called Model Context Protocol, MCP. So maybe you want to talk a bit to that and how that is changing the AI agentic space.
Yeah, I mean, I find the whole conversation around MCP like really interesting and enabling, because so far, if I look back at my experience of working with models, I think especially in the data science, we've always kind of hinged, both data science and quantitative research actually, we've often hinged on this notion of test and control, right? Like, which is like, hey, there are these perfect conditions under which we see how you operate. And with MCP, what's exciting about it is like, there are all these possible variables that could be entering into your model in real time and changing how the models operate. So I find that real-time aspect really fascinating, which is like, suppose if I'm like, like a newspaper, and I am plugged into a bunch of data sources from around the world, the trend of how people are reading content, like it's like ever evolving. And that is just like fascinating, both from a speed perspective, but also just like, okay, how dynamically do you evolve as a business when the model is like constantly giving you a new outcome? So that aspect, I think it's both amazing just based on what is possible, but it's also kind of daunting, because then you have to kind of pause and be like, right, so if the model is so dynamic, how dynamic do I have to be as a leader to take business decisions? Because to some extent, the model is working way faster than me. Right? So then I as a leader can probably change an organization. So that balance of the sort of the modeling and the dynamism around it and taking decisions constantly based on it, I find that quite interesting, which is like how much do we as leaders then have to operate in a whole different cadence of business to stay relevant, and how do you do that? So it was quite interesting. It was on the 1st of April, there was a bunch of companies that put out a promo on LinkedIn saying, hey, we've replaced our CEO with an AI because they can take better decisions than us. And I found that really fascinating. I was like, yeah, it was an April Fool's joke, but that's probably a real conversation, which is like, can human CEOs keep up with models that give you so much information and context and recency in terms of how you move your business forward?
Yeah, that's a fascinating kind of concept.
Yeah.
This kind of reminds me a little bit about, I'm sure you recall that scene from The Matrix where
Yes.
kind of he suddenly wants to learn kung fu and
Yes.
it just uploads it and suddenly obviously he
That's
can.
right.
So this is a similar concept, right? You have models that have an objective, and then you have a bunch of different, effectively data sources or tools that the model can use. And what this is doing is defining these models in these additional tools and data sets in such a way that they can be plugged in, and without necessarily having to retrain the entire model or the entire process. You can go, okay, now I understand how that fits into my workflow. I can start to leverage that. And I suppose this is where, if businesses want to maybe avoid that risk of saying, like, we've plugged in all of our system, we've plugged our CRM, we've plugged in our delivery system and support system, whatever it might be, and everything is running autonomously. How where do we sort of in effect put the brakes in to ensure that the system doesn't run away with itself and maybe mess things up for for customers? Is there a kind of maybe a through prompting you can say, right, okay, if we get to this type of scenario, halt, escalate, that kind of thing, or
Yeah, I mean, I think most businesses who are serious in having an AI forward strategy, I think that conversation about the guardrails has already started, because of course AI can enable a lot of different things, but whether you as a business want to kind of put your decision making on like automatic mode, that's debatable. So I think that we will see more of those discussions, I would think, in the next couple of years, which is like, where is the right balance between human judgment and machine judgment, and how do companies bake that into their approach to AI? And that's where I find, like, going back again to kind of research for a second, is like researchers, ethicists, I think they really have a valuable place in this context to be able to drive a lot of that thinking in leadership in terms of like, where is that right balance?
Yeah. We'd hope that actually if companies get this right, or when companies get this right, it frees up leadership to spend more time thinking through the more challenging business decisions, rather than the kind of day-to-day mundane ones that are repeatable. I think this is where good practice, even in fully human workforce and decision making, is to try to codify where things can be decided across the organization. It might be what's the budget level for a certain item, like you don't have to always pass that up the chain, or things which are reversible, right? Those types of things. So you have a framework. If this is reversible, we'll let the AI take it on as long as it's not impacting above a certain risk threshold or cost price threshold. Otherwise, we'll take it up the chain. Also, then I suppose if you consider when organizations run into challenges and issues, if those learnings are then kind of defined, and you understand what the principles are. There's a famous book, Principles, by Ray Dalio, his whole career spent codifying his learnings, and if that is effectively fed back into the the model, then over time it can make better judgment.
Yeah, 100%.
Cool. Okay, so we'll wrap up with a few reflections. If you could instantly solve one major bottleneck in the AI or data product world today, what would it be?
I think for me, it would be the ecological impact of AI. Because, we are reading some just like fearful things, which is like 97% of the world's electricity might be needed to just like run these machines. And I'm like, that's absurd, because AI usage is not going to go down. And I don't think I've seen as much conversation about the ecological impact as I've seen about like the utilization growth. So I would want to solve that problem, I think.
That's a really good point. And it has moved from kind of the data, basically all the data that's out there has been consumed, and into a, in effect, energy race to who can train the biggest models. And, with data, synthetic data generation and reinforcement learning and these things today, like, basically there's limitless capacity for what you can do to train the models. This is where I think we're seeing some pushes for more, things like experimental things like fusion, and but otherwise, there's a huge amount of energy that's going to have to come from somewhere.
And that's probably also going to lead to a bunch of geopolitical tensions. So I'm like, it seems like the sort of the AI and energy, what do you say? Like the intersection of AI and energy could be a big thing for the next decade, for instance.
I think I was making a point on this in a previous panel. I think it was around how processors are becoming, GPUs and processors are just improving at sort of an exponential rate, and there are improvements that are on the infrastructure level as well. Like, we've Selden as well been doing some optimizations to improve costs, whether it's things like multi-model serving, enabling more models to be packed on a server, or overcommit capabilities to pull models out of memory into cache and scale to zero, these kinds of things. But I think it was Professor Neil Lawrence actually was there on the panel, was saying, well, actually, if you look at look at history, every single time that things have been made more efficient, people have just used more of them, right? Especially when they can have an impact on the economy. So we can expect that exponential demand for energy to increase regardless of how powerful our processors are and how efficient they are. Next one was around what innovations or trends in AI infrastructure or tooling excite you the most right now?
I think what is really exciting me is this ability to be in multiple personas as a single person. So for instance, as I think we've been talking about, it's I'm not necessarily thinking about being agentic per se, or building an army of agents for myself, but to have certain just core critical skills, analytical skills, which then allows you to kind of go into different modes. So tomorrow, if I wanted to run a company, the fact that I could be my own marketeer, engineer, product person, data scientist, being able to move into personas pretty effortlessly, I think that's what's really fascinating for me.
Yeah, it's amazing, really. And then just finally, if people want to follow your work or reach out, what's the best place to connect with you?
LinkedIn.
Okay.
You'll have to go with my name, but LinkedIn is probably the best.
Great. Okay, well, Saswati, it's been a real pleasure having you on this podcast today. Thank you for sharing some fantastic insights on this intersection of user research, data science, AI, LLM, vibe coding. It's been a real pleasure. So
thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Thanks for
Take care.